This is some of the work I'm doing right now, in fact, and it's something that's extremely exciting because it's great when you design an experiment and you go, I hope it works, and it works, you know. So it also points to the way of thinking about systems and the way of thinking about not only agriculture, but the way we approach ecological problems and economic problems. So we talked about when we make alcohol, we make CO2 as one of the byproducts, because, you know, remember, half the sugar the yeast breathe out is CO2. We collect that. And we'll talk about why that's important. We make alcohol. And what part of the grain turns into alcohol? We've been talking about it all night. The sugar, starches, carbohydrates. So that means everything that's not a carbohydrate is not converted to alcohol, and it's there left over in the mash. And that leftover grain has all the proteins and fats and minerals and everything from the soil that became that grain of corn is there in the byproduct, which when it's dried, we call it dried distiller's grains. Okay, I'm going to talk about, this is used as an animal feed. Now, I'll get there in a little bit because we're going to talk about this Monsanto thing. Now, those are the main outputs from, you know, making alcohol. There's a few other things, but those are the big ones. Now, as an organic farmer, and in fact, maybe you can tell us about this, Diane, what do you use corn gluten meal for? What could you use it for? Not everybody uses it for that, but...
I don't know.
Okay. Not everybody does it. It's not totally well known, but corn gluten meal is a protein that is extracted from corn. And it's sold as an animal feed in Europe, but some organic farmers accidentally discovered some years ago that if you sprinkle it on the ground or turn it into the surface, it will stop weeds from sprouting for 3 or 4 months. I see a head shaking. So have you tried it? And it worked pretty good for you. Okay. Got to get the timing right. It's got to be right after you till, before the seeds have a chance to sprout. So corn gluten meal has been known about now for 7, 8, 10 years that you could do this, and some organic farmers for high-value crops use it. Now, this is only one small part of the corn, but it's in the dried distiller's grains because we haven't taken the gluten out. It's there. So my question to myself was, can we use the dried distiller's grains the same way that people use corn gluten meal? And I had a reason for thinking about this, which I'm going to wind us around to. So we did the experiment back at our office recently, and I'll tell you a quick story about this, which is so different than when I did this 20 years ago, is the fever about intellectual property that goes on nowadays. So I called the company and asked them for a couple of sacks of this stuff so that I could test it. And they go, what are you going to do with it? Well, I got this experiment I want to run. And I told them about it, and they go, well, could we buy rights on that? Could we hold that up for a couple of years and see how you come out? I go, I haven't done the experiment yet. And you want to buy rights to it, and I've only got a hypothesis.
You give your .com?
What's that?
It's the .com story.
Well, but this is a farming distribution company. So I said, fine, I'll give you first right of refusal if you'll write me a check. And they wrote me a check. I couldn't believe it. So I did this experiment, and what I found is that we went and got the seeds from the 10 most common weeds in corn, because I figured that's the toughest test. Because, you know, obviously these weeds are exposed to corn, so they would be probably the most resistant weeds to this working. So let's try the toughest test we can. And also, if it works, you know, there's a hell of a lot of corn grown in that this could be used, you know, in that case. So we tried it. And what we found is 5 out of the 10 weeds were outright killed by the stuff. And the other 3 out of the 5, were really stunted. Now, if you're an organic farmer, you're really used to the whole concept of not being absolute about things. Like, you don't have to kill all the bugs. Sometimes you just need to, you know, knock them back a little bit so your crops can get ahead, and then, you know, it's past the stage where those bugs will bother you anymore. So it's a different approach than bug kill, which is the normal agricultural approach. So with weeds, we looked at this being the same thing. We were hoping that it was going to have this absolute herbicidal effect because, you know, that's what everybody wants. But what we found is that the stunting was almost as important because if you can knock down the speed of growth of the weeds, and as you all know, corn grows like, you know, gangbusters, it'll shade out the weeds if they can't, you know, get up to a place where they can poke through the corn. And this is what happened. So most of the weeds were either killed or stunted, so it worked. So this is exciting. I'll explain as a permaculturist how I think about this and came to this experimental design. As you've mentioned, a lot of corn is genetically modified. About 60 to 70% of it now is genetically modified seed. And the modification is almost always to make the seed Roundup ready. Now, Roundup ready means you can grow the corn and you can spray this herbicide known as Roundup right over the corn, and the corn doesn't get affected by the Roundup, but all the weeds underneath get killed. Now, to get this approved, Monsanto had to get the FDA to allow 4 times the amount of residual herbicide on the food, considered safe, but of course Monsanto was more than happy to volunteer the research time to determine that for the FDA, and so their data was used to increase this limit. So this is the kind of stuff that we should be concerned about. So now we've got the corn itself providing dried distiller's grains, which appear to have this herbicidal effect. Now, it's got another effect too before I take you down that road, which is